This is podcast number 1 for Chapter 4 on task presentation. Most learning experiences are delivered to the learner by the presentation of tasks for student engagement with the content. The instructional task describes how the teacher intends the learner to be involved with the content. The practice task asks the learner to engage motorically with the content. One of the most important skills a teacher can develop is the ability to present movement tasks to learners in a way that facilitates appropriate learner engagement with the content. How does a teacher communicate effectively with learners? You have to improve the clarity of your presentation and be clear about what you're asking the students to do. How do you know when you've been an effective communicator? You usually can tell if you've been clear by whether the students are actually doing what you've asked them to do, particularly as far as directions go. Then, if they're performing the skill well, then you know that you've also communicated the content well. One important way to communicate the goals for the lesson is called the set induction, or the beginning or introduction of the lesson. Beginning teachers leave that part out a lot, or they leave out a lot from the introduction that really needs to help engage the students in the learning activity, and also helps motivate them for the lesson. It may seem obvious that to do an effective lesson in physical education, the students have to be attentive to benefit from anything that you're presenting to them. Teachers should not proceed until they have the attention of the students. That also means you should not talk or shout over students. This is the number one beginning teacher mistake that there is, to keep continuing to try to teach when the students are talking. You can present the best task in the world, but it's worthless unless you have the student's attention. And you can prevent a lot of things, a lot of inattention from the students by doing certain things with the content. One thing that's important about establishing signals and procedures that you might want to share with the students is that you have to cover safety first. Safety has to be your number one priority, and it's very important in physical education for the routines and signals to be clear and distractions to be limited. It's also important for the routines to make sure that students sit comfortably at the beginning or the end of class, or even when they're listening to directions in between tasks. They shouldn't be facing the sun or sitting in wet sand or wet grass. You also need to come up with routines for handing out equipment, who's taking turns, who's going to do that each week, how you take roll, the instant activity that you might have before you start the class. Signals for starting and stopping class are very important. Some teachers prefer a whistle. Usually that's used in large or noisy areas. Some teachers prefer to do a particular hand clap or start or stop music to begin a class's activity, or they might say go and freeze. It's also important to limit the distractions of your students. Many times people will walk into the gymnasium who want to fix the lights or take something out of the gym or bring down some chairs or something else. And if you're outside, sometimes you'll have dogs going across the field or airplanes in the sky. But it's important to bring students close if they're having trouble hearing you or seeing you in some way, and face them away from the distraction. Equipment can also be a distraction. Sometimes when students have equipment, particularly balls in their hands, they want to dribble them or volley them in the air or toss them from one hand to another and make noise with them somehow. So it's important to give them something to do with the objects, like place it on the floor, put it under their arm or between their feet. That will help them to keep them still and be attentive to you. Also, when there are people in the area, remind them to focus on the lesson, and usually older students in secondary can be expected to ignore the distractions in the area, but sometimes you have to refocus their attention. If students can't see or hear your presentation of the task, you need to call them to a central spot to be able to reteach the content or give them more extensive directions and so on. As long as the content is brief and not new, it's good to bring them in if you need to remind them of something, especially if most of the class is having trouble with the content. Sometimes it may seem like wasted time, but it will save you time in the long run and a lot of extra questions. Always again put the students back to the sun, and always the students should have a view of the teacher. The biggest inefficient use of time for teachers is that we have a tendency to talk too much. Yes, we talk too much on the podcasts also. Sometimes it takes 5 minutes to say and do what could be done easily in 1 minute, and the student's attention wanes. The secret to effective task presentations, of course, is make it short, but be clear about what you do, what you're telling them to do. Short, smooth transitions between learning tasks and activities are essential, or they will waste a lot of time. That is the number one reason that we waste time in physical education classes, is that we take too much time going from one learning activity to another. When you're teaching the content, one thing that's very clear is that content and cues, the amount of content and cues that students can attend to is definitely limited. Only 1 to 3 cues should be presented at a time. Of course, when you present the content, you always want to present it in a logical progression from one learning task to the next, going simple to complex. But if you have a complex task, you must do the management part first. In other words, get them into their partners, get them into their groups, and then talk to them about how to do the complex task. If the organizational directions are critical to performing the task, present them together. In other words, a volleyball passing toward a net, or when you're going over volleyball passing, the distance between the passer and the net is important, and for them to get used to that distance, they ought to be facing the net on the court as if they were going to be playing in a game. It's usually preferable not to mix organizational directions and how to do a task. In other words, put students and the partners first, as I said before, and then talk about what they are to do in partners. Some good phrases to start with a task is to say, when I say go, I want you to do this, and then you can talk about the content. After I finish, you can do this, and then you can talk about the content. Improving clear presentations can be done in several ways. You need to orient the learner through the induction or the introduction to the lesson. Students feel more comfortable if they know what they'll be doing in advance and why. That's pretty much true of any type of student, whether they're in kindergarten or in college. Also, relate the lesson to a larger whole, which in your case would be a unit. In some cases, it means to a larger whole that's more than just a unit, but basically some larger unit of content. Sequence the presentation chronologically by time, beginning to end, of the skill or whatever task you're asking them to do, or you can go with the most important parts first, which we call backwards chaining. In other words, sometimes you start with the last part of the skill. Always give examples and non-examples. Like, in other words, if you ask them to do a soft landing, they need to know what a hard landing is to be able to uh, understand what a soft landing is. And try to personalize the content through your experiences or the students' experiences. And that's another way to make it culturally relevant. Teachers usually don't like to repeat themselves, but actually repetition is a useful teaching tool, especially if you reteach things to the students that they don't understand. We also like to look at transfer of learning. Try to bridge their past experience with the new experience, or bridge their past experiences in another type of game that's similar to the new game that you're trying to teach them, or the new skill. Always check for understanding and ask students to demonstrate skills, or ask students questions about the directions or the content or whatever they learned in that lesson. And try to present material dynamically. Use voice inflection, not the same monotone voice all the time. And also use nonverbal behaviors that show your enthusiasm as a teacher. You've probably heard of timing in comedy, but timing in teaching is also important. In other words, try to contrast slow talk with quick talk, uh, and that will help keep the learner's attention. This is the end of podcast 1 for chapter 4, and we'll start podcast 2 in just a moment.